Welcome back, deep divers. We're diving deep today into a topic that I think a lot of you have probably been wondering about. We're talking about climate change, and more specifically, all those crazy new ideas and projects to tackle the problem of warming oceans. It seems like every week there's a new headline about some innovative solution.
Oh, absolutely.
So today we're going beyond just talking about cutting emissions. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of what's actually being done.
Yeah.
You know, those hands-on interventions in the ocean itself.
You got it. We're talking about novel marine climate intervention.
Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast. But in all seriousness, it's not just some fancy jargon. This is about deliberate, planned actions to actually change things in the ocean, you know, to try to address both the causes and, this is important, the consequences of a warming planet.
And as you mentioned, it's not just about saving a few coral reefs or something.
Right.
This is about the whole interconnected system.
Right.
We've got a fantastic article to guide us today.
I was just going to say that.
Novel marine climate interventions hampered by low consensus and governance preparedness.
Such a catchy title.
Catchy indeed.
But don't let that fool you. It's packed with insights. What's really cool about this article is it lays out all these different ideas and actions that scientists, policymakers, even everyday people are starting to think about and, in some cases, actually doing something about.
Yeah, like they're already out there doing it.
Yeah.
It's happening right now.
So today we're going to take you on a bit of a journey. We're going to break down what these interventions are, what people are hoping they'll achieve for the climate, but also for other important things where in the world all this is happening, and this is the kicker, whether we actually have the systems in place to manage all this stuff responsibly.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, you know, just because we can do something doesn't necessarily mean we should.
Right. And this article, it really hits on this core insight. We're developing solutions faster than we can responsibly manage them, which, you know, could lead to some unintended consequences.
Definitely. And the article doesn't shy away from the urgency of the situation either.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that, right? Global scientific and political attention on ocean warming is really intensifying, and for good reason. We're seeing some pretty major changes happening in marine ecosystems and, even more critically, in the human communities that depend on them.
Okay, so let's break down those changes a bit, because I think sometimes the whole idea of ocean warming can feel kind of abstract, you know, like what does that actually look like in the real world?
Yeah, it's easy to just see it as a big global problem.
Yeah.
But the impacts are real, and they're happening now.
Right, so give us some examples.
So ecologically, we're seeing species shifting their ranges, moving to cooler waters. Populations are changing. Some species are declining. Others are booming, which can throw the whole balance off. And then there's the impact on biodiversity. We're losing species, and that has ripple effects throughout the entire ecosystem.
And as you mentioned, it's not just about the biology, right?
No, not at all. These changes have huge socioeconomic consequences. We're talking about people's livelihoods, their food security, even their cultural heritage, all being directly impacted by a changing ocean.
And the article gave some specific examples of this, right? I remember those numbers being pretty startling.
They were. For example, they pointed to a 3% per decade loss in fisheries replenishment. That means that year after year, the ability of our fisheries to recover and keep producing food is steadily declining. Wow. And then you have the extreme events, like those marine heat waves that can just wipe out entire ecosystems and cause massive economic damage. The article mentioned that individual marine heat waves can cause losses of over $800 million.
800 million, that's just from one heat wave.
Yeah, just from one event. That really puts it into perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah.
These aren't small, isolated incidents. This is a global phenomenon with huge implications for everyone.
That definitely paints a picture of the scale and the urgency. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about those novel marine climate interventions you mentioned earlier. How are these new approaches fundamentally different from the ways we've traditionally tried to manage and protect the ocean?
It's a good question. And the article highlights 2 key differences. Historically, most marine interventions have focused on things like conservation, restoring damaged ecosystems, or improving the well-being of local communities that depend on the ocean. You know, trying to keep things healthy and sustainable.
Right, sort of a preserve and protect kind of approach.
Exactly. And climate change, if it was considered at all, was usually sort of a secondary concern. But what's really new about these current interventions is that they're directly targeting climate change as the primary issue. And they're doing it in 2 really innovative ways.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are these 2 ways?
So first off, they're increasingly using brand new technologies that we've never really applied to the ocean before. Things like genomics, where we're manipulating the genetic makeup of marine organisms, to try to make them more resilient to change.
Wow, that sounds almost like science fiction.
It kind of is. And then there's stuff like ocean alkalinity enhancement, where they're actually trying to alter the chemistry of the ocean to absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere.
That's wild. So that's the first big difference in new technologies. What's the second?
The second is that they're being deployed in completely new conditions. The ocean is changing rapidly, and the old rules of thumb simply don't apply anymore. So scientists and policymakers are having to come up with entirely new ways of thinking about how to manage and protect these ecosystems.
It's like we're playing a whole new game with a whole new set of rules. And speaking of rules, that brings us back to the whole issue of governance. The big question, can we keep up?
Yeah. The article calls it the pacing problem. They're basically saying that the rate at which we're coming up with these new marine climate interventions is potentially faster than our ability to establish the governance frameworks to manage them responsibly.
Okay, so let's define governance preparedness. What does that actually mean in this context?
It's all about having the right systems and structures in place to ensure that these interventions are developed and implemented in a responsible way.
Right, but what does that actually look like?
Well, it's a complex web of things. It's about having clear rules and regulations, effective oversight and monitoring, involving all the stakeholders, scientists, policymakers, local communities, indigenous peoples, and even industry.
Oh, yeah, so it's not just a top-down thing.
No, not at all. It has to be inclusive and participatory to be effective. It's also about making sure there's accountability and transparency. So that everyone knows what's being done, why it's being done, and who's responsible if things go wrong.
And the article highlighted some pretty serious risks if this governance isn't in place, right?
Absolutely. If we rush into these interventions without carefully considering the potential consequences, we could actually end up doing more harm than good.
Give us some examples of those risks.
Well, for starters, we could further damage already stressed marine ecosystems. Imagine if a well-intentioned intervention backfires and disrupts a fragile food web or introduces a new invasive species.
Oh, I see. So it's about unintended consequences.
Exactly. Then there's the risk of negative impacts on coastal communities. Many of these communities depend on the ocean for their livelihoods, their food security, their cultural identity. If an intervention disrupts those things, it could have devastating consequences.
And what about those governance action arenas the article mentioned? What were those all about?
Right, so those are the specific areas where we need to see governance action. And it's not just the usual suspects, like marine and coastal conservation. We also need to think about the rights and interests of local communities, indigenous peoples, small-scale fishers, those who depend most directly on the ocean and often have the least power in these decisions.
Yeah, their voices need to be heard.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole issue of the growing ocean economy, things like aquaculture, offshore energy, all of that needs to be factored in. And of course, we can't forget about the broader context of decarbonization efforts. It's a complex web, but we need to make sure that governance considers all these different aspects.
So who's actually doing all this work on the ground? Who are the key players in this field of marine climate interventions?
The researchers actually did a really interesting survey. They reached out to 332 different individuals and organizations around the world who are actively involved in these interventions.
Oh, wow. So a pretty diverse group. And what did they find?
Well, the first thing that stood out was that the vast majority of respondents, about 58%, identified as scientists.
That makes sense. But what about other groups?
Policymakers and practitioners from non-governmental organizations, NGOs, each made up about 14%. So decent representation there.
Okay, and were there any other groups represented?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. Only a tiny fraction of respondents, about 1%, were representatives of traditional owners and First Nations. And an equally small percentage, just 3%, were from local community or industry sectors.
Whoa, hold on. That's a huge imbalance.
Yeah, it really is. It suggests that while scientific expertise is obviously crucial in developing these interventions, the voices of those who are most directly affected, those with generations of knowledge about these ecosystems, are significantly underrepresented.
That's a pretty big red flag, right? If we're not including those voices from the beginning, how can we possibly expect these interventions to be truly effective and equitable?
Exactly. It raises concerns about whether the interventions being developed are actually aligned with the needs and values of the communities they're supposed to benefit.
So it's not just about the science, it's about social justice too.
Precisely.
Okay, so we have this group of practitioners, mostly scientists, but some policymakers and NGO folks too. What kind of work are they actually doing?
Well, their involvement really spans the whole spectrum. Some are focused on the early stages, research and development, coming up with new ideas, testing them in the lab.
Okay, the brainstorming phase.
Exactly. And then there are those who are more involved in actually deploying and monitoring these interventions out in the real world, which, by the way, was the biggest category, 63% of respondents.
So a good chunk are actually putting these ideas into practice.
Yep. And then a smaller percentage, about 10%, are focused on policy development, regulation, oversight, the governance stuff we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so working on the rules of the game.
Exactly. And then an even smaller group, just 4%, are primarily involved in funding these initiatives.
That's interesting. So the financial side of things is a pretty small part of this community right now.
Yeah, for now. But as these interventions become more widespread, that could change.
Makes sense. So with all these different types of interventions out there, what are the ones that practitioners are most aware of? What's really on their radar?
Well, the study identified 5 broad categories with 17 more specific subtypes. But there were 2 clear frontrunners in terms of awareness: marine bioengineering and coastal and marine restoration.
Okay, give us some concrete examples of what those categories include.
So within marine bioengineering, the most well-known intervention was artificial habitat manipulation, things like building artificial reefs or restoring oyster beds. That had a whopping 79% awareness.
I've definitely seen those in action. They can be pretty impressive. What about coastal and marine restoration?
That one was all about regrowing targeted underwater species like corals and kelp forests. And that came in a close second with 76% awareness.
Makes sense. Those are pretty visible and impactful projects. And were there any other interventions with high awareness?
Yeah, a few others were pretty up there. Regrowing coastal vegetation like mangroves was one. Also, assisted evolution, where they're basically trying to help marine species adapt to warmer temperatures by, breeding corals that are more heat tolerant.
Ah, so giving them a little boost.
Exactly. And then there's natural stabilization of reefs and coasts. That's all about using natural processes to protect shorelines from erosion and storm surges.
So more of a working with nature kind of approach.
Right. All those interventions had awareness levels around 66%.
Okay, so those are the popular kids, so to speak. What about the lesser-known interventions?
Well, that's where the awareness levels drop off quite a bit. Marine geoengineering, for example, was much less familiar to practitioners, except for techniques aimed at shading or cooling specific areas, which had about 40% awareness. But things like ocean fertilization or ocean alkalinity enhancement were barely on the radar.
So the more experimental stuff is still pretty niche.
Yeah, which makes sense. But perhaps the most striking finding was that awareness of marine socio-institutional capacity building was incredibly low, just 4%.
Wait, what was that again? Remind me what that category is all about.
So it's basically about empowering communities to make climate-informed decisions and strengthen their own local governance related to the ocean.
Okay, so it's about building up the social and institutional structures to deal with climate change.
Exactly. And the fact that awareness of this is so low is really concerning. It's like we're focusing all our energy on developing these technological solutions, but neglecting the human side of the equation.
That's a really important point. It's like we're building this amazing race car, but forgetting to train the driver.
I like that analogy.
Right.
We need both the technological innovation and the social and institutional capacity if we want these interventions to be truly effective and sustainable.
Absolutely. And did the level of awareness differ depending on the type of practitioner like? Were scientists more aware of certain interventions than policymakers, for example?
Yeah, there were some interesting differences. Scientists and policymakers tended to have the broadest awareness across all the different types of interventions.
Okay, so they're keeping up with the latest developments.
Yeah, pretty much. But NGO practitioners and representatives from those underrepresented groups, traditional owners, First Nations, local communities, they generally reported awareness of fewer interventions.
Again, that points to the need for more inclusive engagement, right?
Absolutely. We need to make sure that everyone involved has a clear understanding of the full range of options and their potential consequences.
So let's zoom out a bit. Where in the world are all these interventions actually happening?
Good question. The study found reported interventions in 37 different marine and coastal locations, spread across pretty much every ocean and major sea you can think of.
Wow. So it's a truly global effort. But were there any particular hotspots, so to speak?
Yeah, definitely. Not surprisingly, there was a lot of activity concentrated in those marine areas that are warming faster than the global average.
So the places that are feeling the heat the most.
Exactly. And the biggest hotspot of all was Australia's tropical waters. particularly the Great Barrier Reef region.
That makes sense. They've been dealing with some pretty severe coral bleaching events.
Right. And other regions with a lot of intervention activity included the temperate waters around Australia and New Zealand, the North Pacific Ocean, and the wider Caribbean.
So a mix of tropical and temperate regions.
Yep. And what's really interesting is that in almost all of these locations, there were multiple interventions happening at the same time.
So it's not just a case of picking one solution and going with it. It's more about trying different things and seeing what works.
That's right. It's a very dynamic and experimental field.
And speaking of experimental, what stage of development are most of these interventions in? Are they mostly still in the planning phase, or are they actually being implemented?
Well, it's a mix, but the good news is that most of them are beyond just the drawing board. In fact, the majority, 46%, are at the pilot stage, and another 38% are already being implemented in full.
Oh, wow. So things are actually happening.
Yeah, they really are. Only 16% were still in the conceptual phase. And the most advanced categories were, you guessed it, marine bioengineering and coastal and marine restoration. Those are the areas with the highest rates of full implementation.
So building artificial reefs, restoring kelp forests, all of that stuff is really happening.
Yep, it's moving from theory to practice.
Okay, so we know what they're doing and where they're doing it, but let's dig into the why. What are the main goals that practitioners are trying to achieve with these interventions?
Well, the study found a pretty diverse range of goals, and it wasn't always just about climate change. Some interventions were also aimed at things like protecting biodiversity or improving fisheries management.
So a multi-pronged approach.
Exactly. But within the climate goals, there were two that really stood out. The most common one, mentioned in 57% of interventions, was to increase the biophysical adaptation or resilience of local marine ecosystems to the impacts of climate change.
Okay, so basically making those ecosystems more able to withstand the heat, so to speak.
Precisely. They're trying to boost the natural defenses of those ecosystems so they can better cope with the changes that are happening.
Can you give us some specific examples of how they're doing that?
Sure. Restoring kelp forests and seagrass beds is a big one. Those ecosystems are really good at absorbing carbon dioxide and buffering coastlines from storm surges, so restoring them can make a big difference.
Right, so it's about rebuilding those natural defenses.
Exactly. And then there's the assisted evolution stuff we talked about earlier, helping corals and other species become more heat tolerant. That's another way to build resilience.
And even some of those social institutional interventions, like climate adaptive fisheries management, could contribute to resilience, right?
Absolutely. By making fishing practices more sustainable and responsive to changing conditions, we can help ensure that those fisheries are more resilient to climate impacts.
Okay, so building resilience is the number one goal. What about the other big climate goal, mitigation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so that was the second most common goal, showing up in about 27% of interventions. And there were a few different ways they were trying to achieve that.
Like what?
Well, some were focused on carbon dioxide removal, actually pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it somewhere else.
How do they do that in the ocean?
There are a few different methods. Some are using marine geoengineering techniques like ocean alkalinity enhancement, which basically involves adding certain minerals to the ocean to increase its capacity to absorb CO2.
So it's like giving the ocean an antacid.
Kind of, yeah. And then there were more biological approaches, like certain types of seaweed farming that could absorb a lot of CO2.
Interesting. So there's a mix of high-tech and natural solutions.
Exactly. And some of the bioengineering and restoration projects also mention carbon sequestration as a secondary benefit. Like restoring mangrove forests not only protects coastlines, but also stores a lot of carbon in the trees and the soil.
So win-win.
Right. And this really highlights the fact that many interventions can target multiple goals at the same time.
And I imagine that makes it even more challenging to evaluate their success, right?
Definitely. If one intervention is trying to build resilience, remove carbon dioxide, and improve fisheries management all at the same time, it can be difficult to untangle those effects and figure out what's working and what's not.
Yeah, it's a complex web. But let's go back to the issue of governance, because that's where things get really tricky. The article highlighted some pretty significant gaps in governance preparedness. What were some of the specific examples they found?
Well, they looked at a whole range of governance arrangements that are considered important for ensuring responsible innovation, and they found that many of them were being underutilized.
Like what?
For example, only 11% of the interventions reported actually using data that was co-produced with indigenous peoples and local communities.
So they're not incorporating traditional knowledge into the decision-making process.
Exactly. And only 14% conducted formal ethics assessments before implementing an intervention.
That's a bit worrying.
Yeah, it is. And only 15% had mechanisms in place to ensure accountability and transparency.
So no one's really keeping track of what's being done or who's responsible?
Well, not in a comprehensive way, no. And the numbers were even lower for things like specific measures to mitigate potential negative social impacts or address unintended consequences. Those were only around 15% and 21%, respectively.
That's pretty alarming. It suggests that there's not enough attention being paid to the potential downsides of these interventions.
Exactly. And the risk of causing harm to people or ecosystems is very real if we don't have those safeguards in place.
So if those governance arrangements are lacking, what are the ones that practitioners are using?
Well, it seems like the risk they're most focused on is what the researchers called ineffectiveness risk, basically. The risk that an intervention simply won't work as intended.
So they're worried about whether the technology will actually function.
Exactly. And they're addressing that risk through things like feasibility assessments, using multiple data sources, conducting technical risk assessments, that kind of thing.
So there's a strong focus on the technical side of things.
Yes, very much so. And that makes sense to a certain extent because you want to make sure that the intervention is actually going to achieve its intended outcome.
Right. You don't want to waste time and resources on something that's not going to work.
Exactly. But the problem is that there's this potential imbalance where the focus on technical feasibility is overshadowing those broader societal and ethical considerations.
Like we were talking about earlier, it's all about balance.
Right. And the study found that governance arrangements designed to prevent unintended harms, address public distrust, or deal with issues of negligence were much less common.
So they're not thinking enough about the potential downsides.
Exactly. And one of the most concerning findings was that only 19% of interventions had any kind of mechanism in place to consider opportunity costs.
Opportunity costs.
Yeah, so that's the idea that by choosing to invest in one intervention, you're automatically choosing not to invest in other potential solutions.
Right, it's about trade-offs.
Exactly. And if you're not systematically comparing different interventions and considering their potential costs and benefits, you might end up choosing a solution that's not the most effective or equitable in the long run.
That's a really important point. It's not just about whether something works, but whether it's the best option.
Exactly. And this lack of consideration for opportunity costs suggests that there's not enough critical thinking happening about which interventions are most likely to succeed and which ones might actually be a distraction from more promising approaches.
And did these governance gaps differ depending on the type of intervention?
Yes, definitely. Interventions focused on building social and institutional capacity were actually the ones with the most frequent use of those responsible governance arrangements.
So those projects were more likely to include things like ethics assessments and community engagement.
Exactly. They were taking those broader social and ethical considerations more seriously.
That's encouraging.
It is. But on the flip side, marine bioengineering, those projects, focused on things like artificial reefs and assisted evolution, they have the least frequent use of those governance arrangements.
So the more high-tech interventions are also the ones with the least attention to governance.
Yeah, it seems that way. Which is a bit worrying because those interventions also have the potential to cause the most significant impacts, both positive and negative.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. So given all these governance gaps, do the practitioners themselves see a need for stronger oversight and regulation?
Well, it was a mixed bag. About 23% of them explicitly called for more government involvement, more appraisal, planning, coordination, regulation.
So a good chunk are saying, hey, we need more rules.
Yeah, they recognize that there's a need for more structure and oversight to ensure that these interventions are being done responsibly.
But what about the other side?
Well, 16% actually advocated for less regulation. Yeah, they felt that the existing regulations were actually hindering innovation and preventing these potentially beneficial interventions from being implemented more quickly.
So they see regulation as roadblock.
Exactly. They feel like it's slowing things down and preventing us from finding solutions fast enough.
That's a really interesting tension. So on one hand, you have people saying, we need more rules to make sure things are done safely and ethically. And on the other hand, you have people saying, get out of the way, we need to move faster.
Yeah, it's a tough balance. And it reflects the urgency of the situation. Everyone wants to find solutions to climate change, but there's disagreement about the best way to go about it.
So what were the main reasons given by those who felt that stronger governance was needed? What were their specific concerns?
Well, a lot of them emphasize the need for more rigorous assessment of the interventions themselves, both in terms of their technical feasibility and their potential impacts.
So making sure that we're really thinking through the potential consequences before we do anything.
Exactly. And they also stress the importance of transparency and accountability. Making sure that the decision-making process is open and that people can hold those in power responsible for their actions.
Right, so no more backroom deals.
No, not if we want to build public trust and ensure that these interventions are truly beneficial for everyone.
And what about those who are pushing for less regulation? What were their main arguments?
Well, they generally felt that the current regulatory frameworks were too cumbersome and bureaucratic, that they were slowing down the pace of innovation and preventing us from implementing solutions that could be making a difference right now.
So they see regulation as a kind of red tape that's holding us back.
Exactly. And they argue that we need to streamline the process, make it easier for researchers and entrepreneurs to develop and test new ideas.
It's a tough dilemma. On one hand, you want to move quickly, but on the other hand, you don't want to rush into things without thinking through the consequences.
Exactly. And this really highlights the importance of finding that right balance between innovation and responsible governance.
So what are the key challenges and opportunities that arise from this situation? Where do we go from here?
Well, the pacing problem remains the central challenge.
The fact that innovation is outpacing governance.
Exactly. If we don't address that, we run the risk of making some really serious mistakes.
Like what?
Well, one big risk is maladaptation.
Maladaptation.
Yeah, it basically means implementing interventions that end up doing more harm than good in the long run.
Oh, I see. So it's like a well-intentioned solution that backfires.
Exactly. Like, imagine if we invested heavily in an intervention that turns out to damage ecosystems or displace communities.
That would be a disaster.
It would. And the other big risk is opportunity costs. If we're not carefully considering the trade-offs between different interventions, we might end up investing in solutions that are less effective or equitable than others.
So it's about making sure we're putting our resources in the right place.
Exactly. And the fact that this field is still very science-driven, with limited input from the public, communities, and governments, might be contributing to this problem.
So we need more diverse voices at the table.
Absolutely. And the article also pointed out the influential role of non-state actors in this space.
Non-state actors.
Yeah, so that's groups like NGOs, research institutions, philanthropic organizations, even the scientists themselves. They're often the ones driving the innovation and pushing for these interventions.
But they're not necessarily accountable to the public in the same way that governments are.
Exactly. And that raises some concerns about who's really steering the ship and whether their priorities are aligned with the broader public good.
So we need to make sure that governments and regulatory bodies are more actively involved.
Absolutely. And early on in the process, not just after the fact. One way to do that might be to adopt more participatory frameworks for decision-making.
So involving communities and other stakeholders from the beginning.
Exactly. And another important tool could be integrating bioethical assessments into the development process.
So making sure that we're really thinking through the ethical implications of these interventions before we implement them.
Precisely. And another big challenge is the uneven awareness of different interventions.
We talked about that earlier. The high-tech stuff is getting all the attention while the social institutional approaches are being neglected.
Exactly. And that could lead to funders and policymakers making decisions based on a limited understanding of the full range of options.
So we need to raise awareness of those other approaches.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We need to increase marine climate action literacy across all stakeholder groups.
So everyone understands the full spectrum of possibilities.
Right. And then there's the issue of those social institutional capacity building interventions.
Those are the ones that are all about empowering communities and strengthening local governance, right?
Exactly. And the article highlighted how important those are, even though they're often overlooked.
Why are they so important?
Well, for starters, they can help reduce the risk of those unintended social harms we were talking about earlier.
So things like displacement of communities or damage to cultural heritage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By empowering communities to have a say in the decision-making process, we can help ensure that their rights and interests are protected.
That makes sense.
And these social institutional interventions can also help build trust and legitimacy for the entire field.
So people are more likely to support interventions if they feel like they've had a voice in the process.
Absolutely. It's all about making sure that these interventions are seen as beneficial by the communities they're supposed to serve.